time, but an unauthorized reprint. And the story of how that publication came to be, the copies that still exist, the original owners of those copies, finding out more about Austen's first readership in North America was the pleasure of that research. And then I had reading Austen in America takes us through the 1860s, when Austen's oldest surviving brother received a visit from American fans. And this was contact between Austen's own generation and passionate American readers. Very exciting to discover that. And then I had a gap of about 120, 130 years from the 1860s to the 1990s. And I have filled that gap with the book that you see, which picks up in the 1880s and takes us through Alberta Burke's collecting life. She died in 1975, and her husband, stalwart supporter, died in 1989, and takes us closer to the present day. So the fourth and last chapter of the new book has a Jane Austen pun as its title, A Labor of Love and Friendship. One of those teenage stories written by the young Jane Austen was titled Love and Friendship. And so I've been thinking a lot about labors of love, scholarly labors of love. What does it mean to say that a project is a labor of love? It means you're putting in way more time than anyone else cares about but you. There might not be payment at all. There certainly wasn't for Alberta Burke. And it was just wonderful to discover the intensity and the significance of the friendship of more than 40 years between Alberta Burke of Baltimore and Averill Hassel. And I guarantee you, you do not know her name. She was trained as an artist and art educator, and she created this portrait, and now you see it on the page where we found it at Goucher. So Alberta first, and then Averill. Alberta's birth name was Alberta Hersheimer, and she is a native of La Crosse, Wisconsin. Her mother was from the East Coast, and that's why Alberta came east to Goucher. Longtime Baltimoreans will know that Goucher was founded as the first women's college south of the Mason-Dixon line, not that far south of the Mason-Dixon line, and originally located in Baltimore City in what is now called the Old Goucher neighborhood, south of Johns Hopkins Homewood campus. Alberta attended Goucher in the 20s, graduated in 1928, majored in English, and she went back to her home state university, the fine University of Wisconsin at Madison, to earn her master's degree in literature, and that's where her formal study ended. She did not seek a doctorate, a PhD, nor did she seek academic employment. So she decided somewhere along the way, and she did not document this decision for posterity, somewhere along the way she decided she was going to apply her expertise to being a private collector. She married Henry Burke, a native of Baltimore, brother of one of her Goucher classmates. I tell my undergrads, this is how it happened back in the day. You met those brothers, and then maybe you married one of them. And when Alberta died in 1975, she had arranged to bequeath the great majority of her Jane Austen collection to her alma mater, Goucher, with manuscript items, handwritten documents in Jane Austen's handwriting and a few in her sister Cassandra's handwriting, going to the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York City, as it was then known, now called the Morgan Library and Museum. Alberta and Henry were both intellectuals. They were both fashion-conscious people. They loved classical music concerts. They loved the ballet. They loved theater. They loved European travel. So based in Baltimore and living for many years at the Broadview Apartments on University Parkway, just north of Homewood campus, they were each book collectors, and they were on the train to New York quite a bit to shop, but chiefly for the cultural opportunities. Harry Gershon Berkowitz, he and his siblings changed their surname to Burke in the 1920s, as many of Jewish heritage were anglicizing their names. By profession, he was an estate lawyer, and so intellectual was he that he decided to get a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins just for fun. So he also had that degree. 4 years after Alberta died in 1979, he was asked to be one of 3 co-founders of the Jane Austen Society of North America, which some of you know, JASNA, its acronym. And that organization was founded as the first Jane Austen society outside of the United Kingdom, and currently is by far the largest Jane Austen society in the world, pushing 6,000 members, and a very active region here in Maryland. If you're thinking, I didn't know there was a Jane Austen society, these might be my people, do get to know your Maryland Jane Austen society members. Maryland, that is to say Baltimore, is hosting the annual meeting of the organization next year in October 2025 at Marriott Harbor East downtown. And hundreds and hundreds of, not to say rabid, but knowledgeable and deeply passionate Jane Austen fans will be convening. You might see them on the street wearing their Regency dress. These two snapshots, it turns out, are from the very first transatlantic trip that the Burkes took. Not quite newlyweds, they'd been married for 5 years, but this was the first time they could afford for the transatlantic voyage. And I love that they took turns taking photos of each other. You can see that Alberta left her little jacket on the chair next to her husband when she was taking his photo. This was the first opportunity that they had to visit rare and antiquarian bookshops in England and look for early editions of Jane Austen in person. Alberta's collecting was done in person. It was done through correspondence. She contacted dealers in London. They bid for her at auction. Sometimes she, made her own arrangements to purchase. And then her friend Averill Hassel made extraordinary contributions over many years as well. So this is Averill. She was a little bit younger, born in 1910, and outlived both of the Burkes, living until 1997. And when Averill was young, art education and teacher education in England were wholly distinct from university education, and distinct in the sense of hierarchically looked down on. University education respected, teaching college, art teaching college. Averill was active as an artist throughout her adult life in the very limited time that she had. She was married and had 4 children. And she ran the household. She looked after the children. Her husband was a big cheese. He was a librarian at Oxford's Bodleian Library, and by all accounts, very knowledgeable and deeply, deeply eccentric. So he definitely was not running the household, looking after the children. She was doing that. And what came to light in this research is that the Burkes met Averill entirely by accident on their first trip to England. They were sharing an open railway carriage, and Averill heard the two of them talking and leaned in and said, "Excuse me, have you ever heard of the early 19th century English novelist Jane Austen?" And as Henry Burke later told this story in an audio oral history interview, he said, "Lady, we've not only heard of Jane Austen, she's the reason we're in England." And so these three discovered that they shared knowledgeable enthusiasm about Austen, and a friendship took root that spanned many, many decades. Averill began contributing to Alberta's archive or collection immediately with anecdotes. There turned out to be a connection between her husband's family and the Austens. This happens with English people. There are connections. And Averill tirelessly put into the mail, the post, any item that she thought Alberta would not be able to obtain in the United States, including, as you see, newspaper articles, magazine articles. Averill went to every stage play adaptation of Austen on an English stage that she could easily get to. And not only did send Averill send Alberta the playbills from those productions, she often wrote by hand her own lengthy and informed critique. So for dramatic history, as well as Austen and popular culture history, Averill's contributions are extraordinarily important. Averill made some audio recordings in her later years when her vision did not allow her to write anymore. And she created, as an artist, she created a few art books that are part of the collection. We'll see an example in a moment. My research into Averill began thanks to the man whom you see in the middle of this sketch. This is Averill's son, Mark. And the sketch has been in Goucher's collection all this time, but no one knew what it meant. No one knew how to interpret it, because Mark's initials are there at the lower right, And if you turn it over, you see the sketch was done on Archaeological Institute notepaper. But what does this mean? This means that Mark was employed by the Archaeological Institute. He was an archaeologist. And he made this sketch to commemorate Henry Burke's first visit to the family after his wife's death. So the little date at the lower right says August 75, and Mark in the middle, Henry Burke on the right, and a young gentleman who's not related to our story on the left. And they were at Yeomen of the Guard, enjoying themselves at Gilbert and Sullivan. Mark sent me an email out of the blue in October 2016. He wrote, "I found my mother's name in your book, Everybody's Jane. And you wrote about her in relation to Alberta Burke. And I know that the two of them were friends for more than 40 years. And he wrote, they exchanged long letters constantly. We used to have all of Alberta Burke's letters to my mother." And then he wrote, "Unfortunately, my ex-wife destroyed most of them, but we have one box left. Would you or would Goucher like this box of letters?" And I wrote back and said, yes. Oh my goodness, we would love to have this box of letters. Because what we have in the Austen collection at Goucher is Alberta Burke's professional correspondence. We have her back and forth with dealers. We have receipts of her purchases. We have telegrams saying, "Oh, I got this for you at auction." But we have almost no personal writing at all, because she considered this collection to be her professional labor of love, her life's work, and personal writings were not a part of it. But having spent a lot of time over the years thinking about Alberta Burke, I was deeply curious what she would have written to a longtime friend in personal letters. I hoped that there would be Jane Austen content, of course, but I was also curious about how those letters might illuminate Alberta's life and work afresh. When the letters arrived, I was deep into working on the previous book, Reading Austen in America, and I knew I couldn't expand that book to have a new, oh my goodness, letters have just come to light, new chapter. So I waited. I was very patient, which is unlike me. I waited until the summer of 2018, and Goucher's provost had introduced a new summer research fellowship for faculty outside the sciences. And this is where I can say Goucher has a long and distinguished history of student-faculty collaborative research in the sciences, but to have an opportunity outside the sciences was new. So a student of mine who graduated the following May, Allie Bowerman, Allie and I worked side by side, taking each new letter, transcribing the letters. We thought we might transcribe every word, but it turned out we could be selective. But reading through them, Allie never quite got acclimated to Alberta's handwriting despite best efforts. But there were so many exciting details to follow up on. If Alberta is saying, "Oh, thank you for sending me this book," well, then we went to see, is that book still in the collection? Oh, it is. Oh, look, it has a dedication from Averill. So all kinds of stories were coming to light about objects in the collection, which had been sitting there, truly patiently all these years, waiting for anyone to be able to tell their own stories. So we had a lot of fun. One of the objects that we could understand afresh is this gift book made by Averill for her friend in 1945. And you can see they're not quite on first name basis yet. Mrs. Burke from Averill Hassel, with much gratitude. Averill wrote in a letter accompanying this that she used a print that she had made herself to make the cover. So that black and white artwork is a print of Averill. She decided to repurpose it as a book cover. And on the inside, again, I have to explain to undergraduates, it didn't used to be easy to copy or scan. It used to be a big production. And Averill told a very entertaining story about how, since she was the wife of a librarian at the Bodleian Library, she could obtain a scholarly journal. She could have the Oxford Reprographics Office, whatever it was called in the 40s, make her a white on black photostat of it for her friend. And so this is a wonderful emblem of their friendship and of their outsider status, of Averill, being able to do something through her husband to get a scholarly journal article. And again, for undergraduates today, it's like, oh, just go in the databases. Oh, just ask Google Scholar, everything is there. But Alberta, because she did not have a university position, she could order books very easily, but journal articles were not as easy to get. And Averill was correct in thinking, oh, this will make a special present for my friend. And the 1945, it turned out, was of interest because correspondence between the women reminiscing many years later about wartime in Oxford, Henry and Alberta Burke used a service to send gifts of food and cloth to the Hassels throughout the war. One of Averill's children, she had 3 sons and 1 daughter. It turns out the daughter was Alberta Burke's goddaughter. The Burkes did not have children, and it was news to me that there was a special young person in Alberta's life, and Alberta made sure that there was dress fabric for her goddaughter Corey that went in these packages. And the ex-wife of Mark Hassel, who destroyed most of the letters by mistake, kept the dresses, Corey's dresses, and has washed and starched them. So little emblems of 40s girl fashion, from a fashionable Baltimorean to her little goddaughter in Oxford. Averill worked as an art teacher for many of the years when her children were growing up, and she worked at a school called Holton Park School for Girls in Oxfordshire, which was a public school in the American sense, not in the British sense. And at one point in 1951, the girls in the 4th form adapted Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice, wrote their own script, and with the help of their teachers, put on a play. And Averill documented all of this extremely amateur production for her friend's collection and told all the girls that she was doing this, got them involved. And it's wonderful. I mean, where else would you find the typescript of an amateur production at a girls' high school, along with photographs of them? So the backdrops were created by the art students with their art teacher, who was Averill, and the costumes. Averill consulted on the costumes as well. And of course, girls played all the roles. So that's the Mr. Collins's proposal in the lower right, if you know your Pride and Prejudice. Yeah. Oh, sorry, that was it. So we have these photographs. Actually, we have more than a dozen photographs. And we have a research fellowship at Goucher now, which is available to members of the American Society of 18th Century Studies. We jointly fund the fellowship. And our most recent research fellow last May was a PhD student from the University of Stirling in Scotland named Katie McLean. And Katie McLean is studying dramatic adaptations of Austen through the lens of queer studies. And Katie was very interested in these photographs, cross-referenced them with other materials, figured out which girls were playing which roles. And this production is going to have an important role in Katie's PhD and her ongoing research. Just wonderful, absolutely marvelous. Another existing item in Alberta's collection that we could understand in a new way is this page from Alberta Burke's scrapbooks. She called them her notebooks, but I think the word scrapbook better conveys for us what these contain. They're composition notebooks, black and white marble covered composition notebooks. They do not use archival materials in any way. There's Scotch tape, there's glue. You can imagine how, after many decades, these are a conservation challenge. And my Goucher College library colleagues are busy digitizing these scrapbooks so that fans and scholars and teachers and students from around the world will be able to access them easily and safely. But this is one page showing Alberta Burke's, the print version of her handwriting, which is easier to read than her cursive, though tiny. It turns out but another important event happened in 1951 in world Jane Austen history, and that was an occasion at Frostburg, Maryland, far western Maryland, at what was then called Frostburg State Teachers College and is now Frostburg University. I have to pause to make sure I get the details right on this one. One of the history professors at Frostburg was Alberta's Goucher College classmate from 1928. And that friend put Alberta in touch with the English department people who were planning this. So thanks to the Goucher connection, Alberta generously loaned first editions, rare editions, and many manuscripts. I don't know how well you can see, but the whole top category there is manuscripts. 7 original documents in Jane Austen's handwriting and Cassandra's handwriting that were displayed at Frostburg's University Library for the duration of this festival. And the festival was open to everyone. It was open to community members, students participated. It was a really, to see the program of the festival is to think, what a sweet occasion. There was madrigal singing. Madrigal singing does not have anything to do with Jane Austen's period, but it was a kind of lovely, lovely effort, in the festival direction. And it took me a while to realize that I needed to say this very strongly in the book and say it very strongly when I talk to people as well. There had never been a public exhibition of Jane Austen rare editions and manuscripts anywhere in the world. There had never. And there would not be for another decade and a half. In 1967, which was the 150th anniversary of Jane Austen's death, the British Library, you would expect the British Library to have a Jane Austen show, and they did, and others followed suit. But in the very unlikely location of Frostburg, Maryland, that is where people who were not collectors themselves or who didn't work for libraries had the opportunity to get up close and personal with copies of Austen's novels known and read by her exact contemporaries, as well as these handwritten documents and artworks. So a very special occasion and a point of pride for Maryland and for the US that we were the first ones to host such a thing, thanks to Alberta Burke. And then this is my final image from this section. We have 2 China coffee mugs, as you see here, front and back, in Goucher's collection. This might not seem exciting to you if you are an Austen fan and own 25 different Jane Austen coffee mugs. But in Alberta's collecting career, yeah, you laugh with recognition. I know it's true. In Alberta's collecting career from roughly 1930 until 1975, there was very little merchandise to buy. She bought what there was, one tea towel, but there was very, very little. And whatever there was, she wanted it. She wasn't sure how any of the items in her archive would be useful to future students, teachers, and scholars, but she collected everything just in case. That was her MO. But it turns out that she did not collect either of these mugs. We have a letter in the archives from Averill saying excitedly to Henry Burke, I've just seen advertised there is going to be a commemorative China mug in honor of Jane Austen's 200th birthday. I have bought one to add to Alberta's collection. And Henry Burke wrote back to her and said, I also saw that advertised and have bought one for Alberta's collection. So we have 2, one from either side of the Atlantic. Again, the objects don't tell their own stories, but it's a wonderful story to tell about a long-time friendship, not just between 2 women, but really between 2 couples and 2 families. And before I leave the subject, I have met Mark Hassel in person. I've met him twice in England. He is in his early 80s. He and his family are delighted that anyone is interested in writing about their mother, and very excited that audiences are hearing her story and celebrating her contributions. The book was finished. The book was in the hands of the editors, and we were beginning to think about cover images, always fun. And a student of mine named Grace Fischbach, who graduated from Goucher in May 2022, was employed by Special Collections and Archives, reprocessing the Burke collection, meaning making sure that the written descriptions of everything were up to date, accurate for researchers. And Grace had seen my research on Averill, including that handbound book that I showed you a few moments ago. Grace brought to my attention another handbound book from a box that I had clearly never looked thoroughly through. And Grace said, I think this must also have been drawn by Averill. What do you think? And we looked at it together and I said, oh yeah, absolutely. That's AHB as a monogram up there from AGH. But the library staff member who originally processed the collection didn't have any way of knowing that AGH was Averill Hassel and so hadn't assigned authorship to her. And as Grace and I were looking at this, Christmas 1950, another present, another handmade present, I looked at that image in the lower right-hand corner and I thought, well, that's Jane Austen. That has to be Jane Austen. That is Averill's little sketch. You can tell she just dashed it off confidently. of a woman in Regency dress at a writing slope, pen to paper, turning her face away, thinking about what she's doing. She didn't have to write, "This is Jane Austen," because she could trust that Alberta would know. And the colors are even brighter in person. The pink looks kind of hot pink fuchsia in this, and in person, it really is pretty neon. But I love it as a mid-century modern, one woman artist to a woman collector, a private image of Jane Austen. And no one had recognized it until Grace and I were looking at it together. And then I thought, well, that needs to go on the cover of the book, obviously, as an original artwork by Averill Hassel. So to loop back around, the first chapter in the book, moving chronologically, was the last one that I wrote because I was really scared. I thought it was going to be really boring. I thought Oscar Fay Adams was important. I knew he was important. He was the first American to write a biography of Austen. That fact is known, recognized, but no one had ever really looked closely and thoroughly at his biography or put it in the context of his other writings. And I was afraid that his writings were going to be very boring. And so I wrote this one last, but I was so excited when I got to his writings on Austen because they do not feel like they were written in the late 19th century. His perspective on Austen is remarkably anticipates what we would say today. So here he is. He was born in 1855, died in 1919, a native of Worcester, Massachusetts. And like Averill, he did not get a university degree. He got a teaching college degree from the New Jersey State Normal College, because that's what these things were called. It's now the College of New Jersey. I implore you, do not look up his poetry and his short stories. Please do not. Read his writings on Austen, but do not read his poetry and fiction. My diplomatic phrase is, they have not stood the test of time. Boy, have they not stood the test of time. They're of their time. But it turns out a fact that had been overlooked by almost everybody was that Oscar Fay Adams prepared 2 books about Austen, and the first one was titled Chapters from Jane Austen. And that was where my first surprise occurred, when I looked closely at that book. It has the shape and the presentation of a school book, and that is what it was intended to be. And you can see on the top of the cover on the left and the title page on the right, it proclaims that it's part of a Cambridge series of English classics. This series did not take off. I only found one other title in the series, and that was somebody's edition of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. So Adams, we infer, was commissioned to do this work. No correspondence between him and his publishers survives. That's always where you go when you have questions like, are there letters sitting somewhere in an archive that tell us more about this project? No, there are not. So all we have is the object itself. And we can tell from looking at it that Adams greatly exceeded his mandate of introducing school children to Austen. Oops, no, I want to stay there for a moment. He prepared a bibliography, which to my knowledge is the first ever list of published sources related to Austen to enable study and scholarship. He wrote footnotes for his American readers, explaining terms and concepts and place names and social customs that 1880s Americans could not be expected to know about 1810s England. And he wrote those footnotes in a wonderful, what would I say, non-condescending manner. He wrote them in the sense like he wanted to introduce new readers to Austen. He was inclusive about it. So he didn't talk down to anybody or patronize them or lecture them at all. And so I think this book, Chapters from Jane Austen, is interesting to rediscover. It has gems of insight in it that are expressed in clear, plain language, such that students today would benefit from. Fans would enjoy talking about some of his insights. That is a very important rediscovery, and it's the reason that I now go forth claiming that Oscar Fay Adams was Austen's first critical editor. He compared texts to get the proper text. He did everything that a critical editor would do decades before there was an official scholarly critical editor of Austen. And again, correspondence doesn't survive to connect the pieces of the story, but he went on to write this biography of Austen, The Story of Jane Austen's Life. Not a promising title, it might seem, but it's much more substantial than you would guess. He was not a married man himself, and he was, as we know, a professional author, although not a prominent one. He thought about Austen writer to writer, and he thought about Austen as someone for whom a love story or the lack of a love story in her own life was not the story worth telling about her. So he presented her as a purposeful artist who cared about the professionalism of her work, whose most important relationships were with her family members, who found joy in her creative work. And all of these depictions of Austen ran absolutely in contrast to the dominant myths of the time, which still have a lot of currency today, unfortunately. But the myth that, oh, Austen was a loveless spinster, and yet she wrote such wonderful love stories. How did she do it? And Oscar F. Adams just steered absolutely clear of that approach to Austen and instead portrayed her as an important artist and novelist. As part of his research, Adams went to England. He met descendants of her brothers. He met people who remembered her. He visited every place that he could where she had lived or where she set her novels, so he could convey in his biography the eyewitness detail. Of course, he saw the places as they looked in the 1880s. And he had photographs taken of the places that he saw, and he wanted to put those in the book. He was not allowed to by his publisher in 1891, but he fought to have a second edition published in 1897 so that the photographs could be included. These are the first photographs of sites associated with Austen's life and novels that ever were printed. And they're of great historical importance. This is the building now called Jane Austen's house. It was opened to the public for tourists in 1949, 60 years after Adams visited it. And Lizzie Dunford, the director of Jane Austen's house, Cleve mentioned her kind words in the introduction. Lizzie now uses this photograph in the tours that she gives at Jane Austen's house and tells the story of an American who visited in 1889 and thought it was important to record in photography and share with an audience what this building looked like at the time. And I love this photo too. When Jane Austen's father, who was a clergyman, retired from his position, he, his wife, his two unmarried daughters moved to the city of Bath, also an important place for Jane Austen tourism today. And this is one of the buildings that they lived in as it looked, again, 1889, 1890, not cleaned up at all, showing all that 19th century pollution, and with someone who looks like she's dressed as a domestic servant in the front door. So again, for American readers, very few of whom would ever have the opportunity to travel to England themselves, for an American writer to anticipate, it would be helpful to see these places and to make sure that that happened. That was a huge contribution, a very thoughtful contribution that Adams made. We know that in his own day, his writings on Austen were highly appreciated. And we know that because he kept a clipping service and kept scrapbooks. So it's very easy to see, oh, they were reviewed lots of places, and though he was not remembered after his lifetime for his work, he was appreciated within his lifetime. And then another memorial that doesn't bear his name, but is part of the Jane Austen tourist experience. Jane Austen is buried in the cathedral in the city of Winchester in southern England. There's a gravestone. A later generation put up a brass plaque saying more about her. And Adams, too many people names beginning with A in this book. Adams, as Austen's American biographer, was asked to fundraise in the US towards the cost of this stained glass window. And so that is another contribution that he made in her memory. And then I have just a few things to say about the other chapters. There's lots to read about, and they're a little bit less interesting to show you pictures of and tell stories. Some of you will know the name William Dean Howells. He was best friends with Mark Twain, and in their lifetimes, both were highly respected and eminent, and Mark Twain's reputation has stayed very, very high, and William Dean Howells is no longer considered as central to American literature as he was in his own lifetime. He is remembered as an advocate for Jane Austen, but I would say remembered for the wrong reasons. He wrote quite a bit about Austen, and I think the most substantial and most worth rediscovering writings of his are not the ones that are commonly cited. And I'm so happy to use this relief portrait of him and his younger daughter Mildred, because it turns out Mildred is very important to the story as well. Yes, he was a novelist, he was an editor, he was a columnist. He was one of those people for whom the term man of letters was necessary to cover all of the professional activities that he did. And the essays that I'll be touching on just for a moment were titled Heroines of 19th Century Fiction. But first, Howells's letters were compiled in a critical edition in the 1960s in one of those big scholarly projects common in those decades. But the editors made it clear they hadn't included every single letter that was selected. And as I was looking through the many volumes, I was not seeing as many references to Jane Austen as I would expect for someone who was so passionate about her and wrote about her publicly. And so I made it a little project for myself to read as many unpublished Howells letters as I could easily get to. And I found many references to Jane Austen, which suggests there are many more yet to be found. This was a letter in the Rare Books and Manuscripts Library at Columbia um, to Miss Furman. We can identify her as Dorothy Furman. And he wrote this: "The joy of finding another link in the endless chain of Jane Austen friendships." And that spelling, Freind, is an homage to Jane, who used that spelling quite a bit. And then he went on to write, "My daughter, from whom I have inherited my passion for Miss Austen and Miss Burney." So that answered the question. We knew that Howells had not read Austen until the middle of his life. He also didn't have a university degree, but he was incredibly widely read. He wrote a memoir about what he read as a boy. There was no Austen in there. So I inferred that he didn't read Austen until midlife. Whoops, come back. But here's confirmation. It was Mildred who shared that with him, got him started. Mildred herself was a poet. Don't look up her poems either, please. And she was an artist. She took pride in placing her poems and placing her commercial artwork. She was commissioned to do illustrations for a whist calendar for 1902. Whist is a card game. It's not bridge, but it maybe is a little bit like bridge, and is mentioned by Jane Austen and many other novelists. Mildred did not illustrate Jane Austen's novels, but some of the artworks that Mildred made are suggestive of scenes from Austen, such as this one. If you know Austen's novel Mansfield Park, there's a sexy harpist in Mansfield Park, and certain people can't keep their eyes off her, much as you are seeing in this little picture. And this is a lovely ink drawing of Mildred's that I found in her papers at Houghton Library at Harvard. It was meant for publication. The drawing was meant to surround a poem, and the project never came to fruition. So yes, lines upon reading a garden annual. A garden annual is not a Jane Austen novel, but here we have an image of a woman engrossed in her reading in a pastoral scene. So just briefly, Harper's Bazaar, this is how it was spelled at the time, a magazine for women, published dozens of essays by Howells about 19th century fiction. 3 of those essays dealt with Jane Austen, including this one, which if you're reading it while I'm talking, is telling you that Howells almost says that Jane Austen was a revolutionary writer. Doesn't quite say that, but no one else said anything of the kind until the mid 1970s. So Howells was way out front, saying, perhaps Austen was asserting the rights of man as unmistakably as the French revolutionists. And he has lots of other insights, and like Oscar Fay Adams, he knew he was writing for a broad audience, so he was writing as clearly and plainly and engagingly as he could to build a readership in the new generation. His essays were illustrated by the leading commercial illustrators of the day, and these illustrations are not well known. Many of them, I think, are worth discovering, especially those by Rosina Sherwood, as you see here, an illustration of persuasion. This one, perhaps not as worth rediscovering. Howard Chandler Christie making Emma and Mr. Knightley look a little bit stiff. And this truly horrible portrait of Jane Austen at her harpsichord. Don't know why that was in there. Howells never mentioned music making in Austen at all. And then last but not least, those of you who are big Jane Austen fans and buy the merchandise will know that Jane and her sister Cassandra owned topaz cross pendants set in gold that were gifts from their younger brother Charles. And this chapter is about the American who bought those crosses for his own Jane Austen collection in the 20th century and who had other treasures that no one knew about. But him, here he is. Charles Beecher Hogan, he's Alberta Burke's direct contemporary, also born in 1906. But whereas she went to Goucher, he went to Yale, and he stayed at Yale. He got his undergrad degree, he got his master's degree, he worked in Yale's libraries, he taught in the English department, he lived in Connecticut for the rest of his life. He was a lifelong, as we say, Yale man. And here he is in his, it's not quite a yearbook, but sort of. We knew how Jane Austen and Cassandra Austen received these crosses, but it wasn't known when they were put up for sale by family descendants and when they were bought by Hogan and what they meant to him. So dates. He graduated in the class of 28 from Yale. He bought the crosses in 1927. He was a Yale undergraduate. It turns out he had a windfall inheritance from an aunt, and he thought the best thing he could do with it would be to buy wonderful trophy Austen collection items. I mentioned earlier the very first edition of an Austen novel printed in North America, Emma, from 1816. Hogan owned one of those copies. I love this slide. I won't linger on it. I rediscovered 2 of the copies. I'm super excited about all of them. Goucher has fully digitized its copy, and you can read it for yourself at emmainamerica.org. When I visited Hogan's copy of the 1816 Philadelphia Emma for the book Reading Austen in America, I saw in the catalog at Yale's Beinecke Library that he also had one box, a Jane Austen collection. And I thought, oh, I really want to open that box, but I better come back another time. I did come back. I opened the box and I discovered these treasures, books in which Hogan kept track of every book he read from 1923, when he was still in high school, to 1942. And not only did he write down the titles and the authors, he wrote down a couple sentences, not more than a couple sentences, about what he thought. And with Austen, he read, he reread, he revisited his earlier opinions and commented on what had changed. And this is an extraordinary resource. Today, we're used to the idea that people keep track of their reading on Goodreads and blogs and all kinds of social sharing sites. But to have a written record of a passionate reader and scholar's impressions over nearly 20 years is really unusual. So you will have had time to read that initially he thought Mansfield Park was perfect and he wished it would go on forever, which no one has ever thought. But a couple years later, you give a man some Yale education and he's able to write critically. Contains the greatest feeling of moralizing. Yes, we can agree. And it goes on from there. He was married in 1933. This wedding was covered in newspapers throughout the US because the woman he married was very, very rich. Her father owned one of the grain companies that later was combined to form General Mills. And that's why she was a flower heiress, Flour, ha 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 ha, flower heiress. And his gift to her was the 2 topaz crosses. And she wore one of them on her wedding day. But which one? We don't know. And I just love this portrait of the 2 of them, long-faced, and then the little illustrations suggesting that she's moving from being served by a waiter in an elegant restaurant to having to pour the tea for her husband. Oh no, how will they survive on $45 a week? Yeah, breathless Depression-era journalism for the masses. In 1974, decades later, Hogan was invited to the Jane Austen Society, JAS, in England to be its plenary speaker. and he showed up with the topaz crosses in his pocket and pulled them out at the end of his speech and said, "I'm donating them today. This is my prop. I only have one." Um, this is a replica that you can buy for yourself. Um, and no one at the meeting remembered what he talked about at all because they just utterly lost their cool when he pulled the Austen sisters' topaz crosses out of his pocket. Delight and considerable emotion. So the crosses ever since then have been on display at Jane Austen's house in Chawton, and that's where you can visit them. So my last thing to mention to you, Goucher will be celebrating Jane Austen's 250th birthday next year on campus. And I have the honor to be the guest co-curator for the Morgan Library in New York City of their Austen show, which we have titled A Lively Mind, Jane Austen at 250. And this is the first Austen exhibition in the United States to feature her manuscripts from the Morgan's extensive collection, many bequeathed by Alberta Burke, as well as key loans from Jane Austen's house in Chawton, including the turquoise ring, which is another exciting object for Austen fans, a lock of her hair, and more, as you see. So I hope if you are able to take the bus or the train or drive up to New York next year between June and September, that you will be able to see that and at least let the Jane Austen fans in your life who are, in that geographical region know that that's coming. Super excited about that. And I hope they will agree to make Averill's portrait the key image of the show, because I really want to see that everywhere in New York next year, but that is yet to be confirmed. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions, and I'm happy to chat with you more over books. And I remember I'm supposed to repeat questions. Oh, terrific. Oh, that's a great question. So how have American audiences engaged with Austen's writing differently from English audiences? Over the centuries, considerable differences. I would say that Americans have, in general, felt a sense of freedom and liberty in interpreting Austen for themselves and thinking of her as an author rather than as an English woman who happened to be an author. And I think especially because the earliest biographical writings about her were done by her family members and her male family members. So the agenda is so easy to see in those early biographical essays and books, protecting the family reputation, suggesting that she didn't have any inappropriate professional ambition. Oh, heaven forbid. Whereas Americans never had any sense that they ought to be in that kind of relationship to her. So I think Americans felt free to be fans and enthusiasts from the beginning, and those Americans who had enough academic training to do scholarly work, like Oscar Fay Adams, had a sense that they could say what they wanted to about Jane Austen, and they didn't have to kind of toe any particular line about her. And then in the present day, Americans were the ones who started dressing up. English people were very excited to find that they could dress up, but Americans led the way on that with all the cosplay and all the dancing for fun and fan activities. The Jane Austen Society of North America has always been a lot more freewheeling and fun, and let's do a dance workshop. That's part of what makes our reading exciting, as opposed to the Jane Austen Society UK. There are exceptions. Broad brush. The Scottish branch of the Jane Austen Society UK is a lot more fun. And they'll say, it's because we're Scottish. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. So in Mansfield Park, the cross is amber. So the version of this story that Austen reinvented and imagined to include in the novel involves a brother buying his sister an amber cross set in gold. And the reason for the amber is that brother is in the British Navy and he's near Sicily, and that's where you get amber. The Austen's younger brother, Charles, I think topaz was what he could get, and this was a generous, not to say foolhardy, gift from a young man. Those of you who have read your Patrick O'Brien novels, you know that the way you made money in the British Navy was not your salary; it was your share of the prize money when your ship captured a French privateer or another ship. So young Charles had a big bonus and he decided, I mean, what a generous, thoughtful thing to do to give to his two older sisters, who were both would have been considered very unlikely to marry at that age, to give them jewelry that was an emblem of Christian faith that they could wear. I mean, younger brother, really a lovely thing. But why topaz? I'm not sure we have much more insight into the why topaz. Yeah. Oh, it was. Oh boy. Mm, mm. Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking about 1995 as being the landmark year. What makes 1995 so special is that so many separate projects came to fruition that year. And we have an understanding now, I think maybe more than average folks did in the 90s, of how long it takes a film to be made, how long it takes a television series to be green lighted and planned. So the fact that within a calendar year, within 12 months, I should say, the British Broadcasting Company, BBC, released the six-part Pride and Prejudice miniseries, which fans still today, imprint on. Jennifer Ely and Colin Firth. Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility, for which she wrote the screenplay, won the Oscar for Best Screenplay and also portrayed Eleanor Dashwood. And that Sense and Sensibility film was the first Austen feature film adaptation since 1940. It was the second ever. 1940, black and white Pride and Prejudice, Laurence Olivier, Greer Garson, hoop dresses, not Regency costume. Yeah, so there had not been an Austen feature film in all those years. Suddenly there was that one, and then there was Clueless, which absolutely reached audiences who had no idea it had anything to do with Austen. Still, my undergraduates will come to class and I say, "Did you know Clueless was an Austen adaptation?" And they say, "No," and then they start spouting the script. So Clueless will live forever. And Persuasion, which was made for television in Britain and was broadcast was distributed in cinemas in the US. And my claim to fame, my Baltimore claim to fame, I was an undergrad living in Mount Vernon in the 90s. I saw Clueless at the Charles Theater. I saw Sense and Sensibility at a little theater near Fort McHenry that doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. And I saw Persuasion at the Charles Theater. And I remember this because it was on cable and we didn't subscribe to cable to get A&E. I'm happy to celebrate the work of my current Goucher student, Kaylee Ray Williams, who has been entrusted by Jane Austen's house with a special exhibition for their exciting 250th birthday year next year, celebrating the legacy of all these 1995 adaptations, principally Clueless. So Kaylee's working on that now, and Jane Austen's house will have it up in January for visitors to see. But you asked, has there been another single year? Not in which a lot of big things that had staying power came out. Yes, there was the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice, which has had a lot of, which still is exciting to younger audiences. There have been individual items in individual years. Probably next year. I mean, anybody who has any Austen idea is trying to get the book out next year, and there will be exhibitions around the globe. So let's hope that 30 years from now, people remember 2025 fondly instead of thinking, well, they could have done a better job celebrating her. Besides my books, what book would I recommend for Austen scholars who are new to the field? So Austen Studies is big enough now, and that's thanks to 1995 in part, that there's so many of us who are able to teach Austen adaptations and popular culture. Austen Studies is big enough that there are many subfields within Austen Studies. So my area, you could say, is the history of reading or reception studies. How did people get their books and what did they think of them and what did they do in response and how were new readerships encouraged and formed? And the other folks in reception studies to recommend include Katie Halsey, Devaney Loser, and Janine Barkus, chiefly. Um, and outside of that, I know it depends what your interests are. There are an increasing number of really well-written books for general audiences that you can find at your public library, as well as more scholarly monographs every year. But I will put in a shameless plug for the Penguin Classics Deluxe editions, for which I did Emma in 2015, Persuasion in 2017, and I'm working on Mansfield Park to be released next year. These were designed from the beginning, and I was the one who designed them, starting with Emma, designed the contents to be an all-in-one, reader-friendly, this was the phrase I came up with, reader-friendly introduction to Austen. So the kind of book I would want to give my dental hygienist. When she says, well, what do you teach? And I say, Jane Austen. And she says, I've never read any Jane Austen. What should I start with? I wanted to be able to say, not just start with this novel, but start with this edition because it will give you exactly what you need to know and not too much. It will get you started in a really friendly and relaxed manner. And then there are lots of other editions that you can move on to that have more and more and more and more. So thanks to Elda Rotor, Vice President of Penguin Classics, for getting that series started and working with me and with Patricia Matthew of Montclair State University to complete the series for next year. Yeah. Oh. So in the presence of all these Poe portraits, I'm being asked about Mark Twain's disparaging comments on Jane Austen. These were in his private writings, letters, journals, and several of them were written to or said to his good buddy William Dean Howells, who was, as we know, a hardcore, ardent Janeite, Jane Austen fan. So I would take them all in that joshing spirit. And when Twain wrote, every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and hit her over the head with her own shin bone, note that he starts every time I read Pride and Prejudice. It's not that one time I tried to read Pride and Prejudice. So it's jokey. I mean, it's not they aren't nice things to say, but I don't think we have to take them too terribly seriously. The people who worry me are the people who say proudly in print that they have never read Jane Austen. Stephen King said that to the New York Times Book Review. I've never read Jane Austen. And I thought, Stephen King, read some Jane Austen. You might, people read Jane Austen and Stephen King. Those can go together quite nicely. Yeah, please. Hmm. Okay. So then the scholars' names whom I mentioned are all female, and the editors' names and are women in charge. We can be grateful to many male screenwriters, directors, and actors who have contributed to some of the memorable and wonderful adaptations. It's by no means the case that only the adaptations written and directed by women are worth remembering, although they do tend to be very good. Um, my Jane Austen courses at Goucher, sometimes they have all women and non-binary students. Sometimes there's one guy. One memorable semester, I think there were 3 or 4 guys. But at one point when I was going back and forth on the content of this book with the commissioning editor at Bloomsbury, he said, there seem to be, all the chapters are about men except for the last one. Is there any way that you can bring out the women more? And I said, there are women there, including Mildred Howells. And also, it's important as a historical corrective to this idea that Jane Austen is for chicks. That we see that they were men proudly, publicly proclaiming their appreciation for Austen, urging people to read her, 100+ years ago. It's true that the Jane Austen Society of North America is majority non-men. That is definitely true. But here's an opportunity in your own life. Teenage boys can read Austen, and when they read Austen, discover that she has a lot to say, not just to chicks. So push it. Put Austen in the hands of new readers. See what will take, or show them a movie, or show if Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is going to do it, then use that. Whatever way I can plant a seed. Thank you all so much.